Story 1. The Administrative Revolution of Diocletian. The Roman Empire at the turn of the 3rd century was in every sense exhausted. You can imagine yourself standing in a dusty provincial forum, perhaps in Antioch, perhaps in Lugdunum, where a tattered imperial edict has been nailed to a marble wall. The words are faded, the Latin formulaic, and the signature of an emperor you may not have even heard of. The man on the throne changes every few years now. The tax collectors still arrive on time. The soldiers still march. But something feels hollow. The 3rd century had been one of crisis, a slow, administrative collapse rather than a sudden implosion. For nearly 50 years, emperors rose and fell in dizzying succession. The legions had grown accustomed to declaring their own candidates for the purple. Governors balanced loyalty with self-preservation. Communication from Rome could take months, and by the time an order reached the provinces, the emperor who issued it might already be dead. To the average inhabitant of the empire, it was not chaos in the sense of anarchy. Markets still opened, bread still baked, taxes still collected, but chaos in the sense of confusion. Who truly ruled? Whose authority mattered? It was in this exhausted empire that Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus Diocletian rose to prominence. A soldier bureaucrat. Diocletian was not born into nobility. He came from Dalmatia, a coastal region along the Adriatic, known more for its hardy soldiers than its scholars. His ascent through the army was steady, not spectacular. He was not a man of charisma or philosophical brilliance. He was rather competent, reliable, the kind of man who could organize a camp, feed an army, and avoid unnecessary risks. When he was declared emperor in 284 CE, following the death of Numerian, he inherited a position that no single person could realistically manage. The empire's borders stretched from Britain to the Persian Gulf. Every frontier demanded attention. Every army needed pay. Every governor had ambitions. Diocletian's genius was not in military conquest or personal bravery, though he possessed both, but in organization. He saw the empire not as a divine inheritance, but as an administrative problem to be solved. The empire as a machine. To understand Diocletian's reforms, you must picture the empire as a massive, rusted mechanism. The gears still turned, but unevenly. The provinces had grown too large, too autonomous, and too dependent on local power structures. Rome, as an administrative center, was no longer practical. The emperor could not govern effectively from the Tiber while threats emerged on the Rhine or in Syria. The bureaucracy that had once served Augustus had become inadequate for the needs of an empire of 60 million people. Diocletian's answer was simple, in theory. Divide responsibility, multiply oversight, and codify authority. He expanded the imperial bureaucracy to an unprecedented degree, creating a lattice of offices that reached into every corner of the empire. Each province was subdivided, creating smaller units that could be more closely managed. Above them, larger regional groupings called dioceses were established, each overseen by a vicarius literally, a substitute of imperial authority. The empire itself was divided into two halves, each governed by an Augustus with his own Caesar as junior partner and successor. It was, for the first time, an empire designed not around one man's will, but around an enduring administrative system. The logic of division. To modern ears, division may sound like weakness, but to Diocletian, division was strength, a way to prevent the collapse that had threatened Rome so often. Each Augustus could focus on a region's unique problems. In the east, Persian diplomacy and Egyptian grain required delicate attention. In the west, barbarian incursions along the Danube and Rhine were constant. The Caesars were not merely deputies, they were apprentices, meant to learn governance under supervision. When an Augustus died or retired, the Caesar would step up, ensuring smooth succession. At least, that was the theory. The Tetrarchy rule of 4 was not born from idealism, but necessity. And beneath its structure, Diocletian quietly revolutionized every aspect of imperial administration. The everyday machinery of control. Under Diocletian, paperwork became the empire's new weapon. Edicts were copied and distributed by an army of scribes. Census data was collected to ensure fair taxation or at least consistent taxation. Soldiers were counted, supply chains mapped, and officials held accountable. The empire, for all its grandeur, became a bureaucratic organism. Governors were rotated more frequently to prevent corruption. Local elites were drawn into the system as curials, responsible for maintaining civic order and tax collection, often at their own expense. It was not a system designed for kindness. Tax quotas were inflexible. Responsibility flowed downward, punishment upward. But for the first time in generations, the empire operated with a semblance of predictability. And for the average farmer, merchant, or craftsman, predictability meant survival. The human cost. Yet predictability had its price. The new bureaucracy demanded precise records of land, livestock, and people. A farmer who once paid taxes in grain now had to account for every measure harvested. If a village failed to meet its quota, its elders were held personally liable. Mobility was restricted. Peasants tied to land for tax purposes could no longer move freely. Sons of soldiers were expected to become soldiers. Sons of craftsmen inherited their father's trade. The empire had become, in a sense, a machine built from human parts. The system was efficient but suffocating. Still, for Diocletian, it worked. The frontiers stabilized, revenues increased, revolts subsided. For a brief moment, the empire seemed governable again. The emperor behind the curtain. Diocletian himself retreated from public familiarity. Unlike his predecessors, he rarely appeared in person before the people. When he did, it was as a god-emperor adorned in silk, surrounded by ceremony, approached only through layers of ritual. Gone was the approachable soldier emperor. In his place stood a distant sovereign, elevated above the mortal plane. The system demanded reverence, not affection. This deliberate distancing reinforced hierarchy within the Tetrarchy. If the emperor was divine, then his bureaucracy was sacred, his orders immutable. A system that could not sleep. Even as the machinery of the empire whirred into motion, cracks formed beneath its surface. Local governors resented interference from the vicari. Soldiers grumbled under tighter discipline. Provincial elites, once semi-autonomous, now felt suffocated by imperial oversight. And yet for the time being it worked. Grain shipments flowed, frontiers held, temples gleamed. If you closed your eyes in those years, you might almost believe the empire had rediscovered its golden age. The illusion of permanence. But systems, like empires, depend on people, and Diocletian's system depended on obedience. The Tetrarchy could manage 4 emperors, 4 courts, 4 armies as long as each accepted the other's legitimacy. Diocletian's genius had created structure. His challenge was ensuring loyalty. And as he aged, one question lingered in every administrator's mind, whispered in corridors and written in cautious letters between provinces. What would happen when Diocletian was gone? The system that Diocletian built, in all its orderly rigidity, functioned only as long as its designers remained in place. The question that loomed, what happens when Diocletian is gone, would soon be answered, and not in the way he had intended. But before we reach the slow unraveling of the Tetrarchy, let's pause to examine the nature of Diocletian's partners, not as grand figures on coins or marble statues, but as administrators, as men, as gears in the imperial machine. The first tetrarchs, colleagues not rivals. In 286 CE, just 2 years after becoming emperor, Diocletian raised his trusted colleague Maximian to the rank of Augustus, making him co-ruler in the West. It was a decision born not from sentimentality but logistics. Diocletian understood that no single emperor could handle the empire's dual challenges: internal fragmentation and external pressure. Maximian governed from Mediolanum, modern Milan, facing threats from Germanic tribes and revolts in Gaul. Diocletian remained in the east, with a base in Nicomedia, addressing Persian threats and consolidating Egypt. The empire, once again, was split, but this time deliberately. Then in 293 CE, Diocletian and Maximian each appointed a Caesar to serve as junior emperor. Galerius, Diocletian's Caesar, was a rough soldier of Balkan stock, brutal, competent, and fiercely loyal. Constantius, appointed under Maximian, was calmer and more diplomatic, with a reputation for leniency. This structure, two Augusti, two Caesars, formed what would become the Tetrarchy, from the Greek tetra, four. It was, above all, a flowchart of power. Authority was clear. Succession was defined. Regions were assigned. In theory, it was brilliant. The routine of governance. Each emperor, whether senior or junior, ruled a defined region of the empire and was responsible for its military defense, judicial systems, and financial health. But their policies were coordinated. Decrees were often issued in the name of all four rulers. Coins bore their likenesses in equal measure. Temples honored them collectively as the four rulers of the world. This careful symmetry extended even to public imagery. Statues of the tetrarchs depicted them nearly identically, blocky, abstract, clad in identical armor, embracing one another. Individuality was erased in favor of unity. To a Roman citizen in Spain or Syria, the new system may have seemed peculiar, even cold. The emotional bond between emperor and people, cultivated since Augustus, was gone. In its place was a pantheon of faceless rulers, present only through taxes, orders, and the occasional visit. Yet this detachment was intentional. The system was built to outlast personalities. Retirement, an unprecedented move. In 305 CE, Diocletian did something no emperor had ever done before. He retired. He did not die in office, assassinated or poisoned. He did not flee in disgrace or fall in battle. Instead, he withdrew from power with ceremonial dignity, returning to his palace in Split, Dalmatia, to tend his gardens and live in relative peace. Maximian, under pressure, retired alongside him. It was the ultimate test of the Tetrarchy, peaceful transition. Galerius and Constantius, the Caesars, were promoted to Augusti. New Caesars, Maximinus Daza in the east, Severus in the west, were appointed. The mechanism turned just as planned. And yet, almost immediately, the balance began to wobble. The problem of sons. Constantius Chlorus, ruling the western provinces, had a son, a tall, sharp-minded young officer named Constantine. Galerius, meanwhile, had no children but plenty of ambition. When Constantius died suddenly in 306 CE while campaigning in Britain, his soldiers proclaimed Constantine emperor. It was a deeply traditional move reminiscent of the 3rd century crises and a direct violation of the Tetrarchic order. Galerius, now senior Augustus, was furious. Constantine had not been designated Caesar. The proper successor, according to the Tetrarchic chain, was Severus. But reality ignored bureaucracy. Constantine held the loyalty of the Western army and the support of the people. Soon after, another usurper, Maxentius, the son of the retired Maximian, declared himself emperor in Rome. His father, once content in retirement, returned to power at his side. In a matter of months, the tidy balance of the Tetrarchy collapsed into a chessboard of claimants. Too many emperors. By the end of 307 CE, no fewer than 6 men claimed imperial authority. Galerius, still technically senior Augustus in the east. Maximinus Daza, his Caesar. Constantine, declared emperor by the army. Severus, Galerius's choice for the west. Maxentius controlling Rome. Maximian returned from retirement. The empire once again had no clear center. The Tetrarchic system, so carefully designed to prevent civil war, had done just that. The root of the problem was human. Diocletian's system had assumed compliance, but emperors were still men with ambition, blood ties, and armies. No mechanism, however well designed, could suppress family loyalty or personal pride. The ghost of Diocletian. From his palace in Split, Diocletian watched this unraveling with bitterness. According to one tradition, when urged to return and restore order, he reportedly said, "If you could show the cabbage I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggest I replace the peace of this garden with the storms of politics." It was not cowardice, it was disillusionment. Diocletian had created a system, not a dynasty. He had tried to free the empire from personal politics, but Roman society, deeply patriarchal and lineage-driven, was not ready to separate family from rule. The Tetrarchy had been an artificial order, imposed on a society still obsessed with bloodlines and charisma. Galerius and the East. Galerius, to his credit, attempted to restore order. He convened a conference in Carnuntum in 308 CE. Diocletian, reluctantly, appeared in person, the only time in retirement he would do so. The conference declared Maximian would retire again. Constantine would be demoted to Caesar. Licinius, a loyal general, would be named Augustus in the west to replace Severus, who had died. But it was too late. Constantine ignored the demotion. Maxentius refused to step down. Maximinus Daza in the east demanded promotion. The empire was now in free fall, not from invasion, but from over-administration. The unseen bureaucracy amid chaos. And yet, remarkably, the empire still functioned. While the emperors clashed and plotted, grain still moved from Egypt to Rome. Tax quotas were still assessed. Imperial officials, mostly insulated from political chaos, continued to process edicts, conduct censuses, and enforce law. This was perhaps Diocletian's most enduring legacy, a bureaucracy that could survive emperor after emperor. You can imagine a minor administrator in Gaul, perhaps in Arelate, modern Arles, copying a tax notice in 310 CE. He might not be entirely sure who the emperor was, but the form was the same, the seals unchanged. The imperial machine, once set in motion, did not stop easily. The inheritance of Constantine. By 312 CE, Constantine had secured control of the West. His march on Rome, culminating in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, would mark the end of Maxentius and a turning point for the entire empire. But what Constantine inherited was not just a throne. It was an imperial system that bore Diocletian's fingerprints. He would use Diocletian's administrative map. He would rely on the same provincial structure, the same tax codes, the same expectations of control. Even his eventual creation of a new capital, Constantinople, would mirror Diocletian's relocation to the east. The Tetrarchy had failed as a political solution, but as a bureaucratic foundation, it endured. A system without its architect. When Galerius died in 311 CE, the last original tetrarch was gone. Diocletian had already been dead for years, his quiet burial in Dalmatia unmourned by most. But the empire he helped reshape remained. His reforms, property assessments, hereditary professions, diocesan boundaries continued long after the Tetrarchy dissolved. Even the idea of multiple emperors, ruling divided territories, would persist into the Byzantine period. The Tetrarchy did not end. It evolved, fragmented, and was absorbed into the empire's DNA. And the question that haunted Diocletian's final years, can a system ever fully control ambition, remained unanswered. The empire that Diocletian sought to stabilize was one of immense size, complexity, and contradiction. His reforms had created a framework of governance that endured emperors, revolts, and civil wars. Even after the political failure of the Tetrarchy, its bureaucratic skeleton remained intact, managing, assessing, and regulating daily life in a world increasingly defined by paperwork rather than people. This is the story of what happened after Diocletian, not in the annals of high politics, but in the minutiae of ledgers, legal codes, tax scrolls, and census forms. While Constantine and his rivals contended for the throne, the administrative engine Diocletian had built continued to hum beneath their feet, like a machine too massive to notice but too important to stop. The hidden empire, dioceses, vicariae, and the logic of rule. If you were a Roman citizen living in the early 4th century, chances are you had never seen an emperor, but you had seen the system he created. You paid your taxes to a local official, a decurio, who was part of the curial class, local elites tasked with collecting taxes, maintaining roads, overseeing grain storage, and reporting census data. If a city's tax burden fell short, the curials were responsible even if they had to cover the shortfall from their own wealth. Many tried to escape these positions, even appealing to the emperor for release. Few were granted it. Above the curials stood the provincial governor, a familiar office, but now under the watchful eye of the vicarious a representative of the emperor overseeing multiple provinces within a newly created diocese. These dioceses were not religious territories yet. They were administrative zones, each with an imperial inspector and access to the growing civil service. The goal was clarity, precision, accountability. Diocletian had doubled the number of provinces to about 100. Each was small enough to be managed tightly and hard enough to rebel alone. This bureaucratic fragmentation made large-scale dissent difficult, though not impossible. The codification of empire. In the years after Diocletian's retirement and death, one of the empire's greatest legal undertakings began. The Codex Gregorianus and the Codex Hermogeneanus, compilations of imperial law. These were not literary works but working documents, tools for judges, governors, and legal scribes to understand precedent and apply it consistently. Laws were categorized by topic: land, inheritance, military discipline, taxation, and more. The tone was impersonal, the logic inflexible. Justice was to be applied, not interpreted. Imagine a small land dispute between two families in a Gallic town. The local official would consult one of these codes to determine not only what law applied, but how it had been enforced previously, whether in Africa, Syria, or Illyricum. The Roman Empire had become an early model of legal consistency across vast distances. Diocletian's bureaucracy demanded such consistency. If the law differed from one province to the next, so might loyalty. The census and the capitatio iugatio system. Perhaps the most significant and quietly burdensome reform Diocletian introduced was the overhaul of the empire's tax system. At the heart of this reform was the capitatio iugatio, a land and head tax assessed through a detailed census. Every 5 years, imperial agents conducted evaluations of land units iuga, defined by soil quality, water access, and productivity; persons capita, including their labor ability, profession, and legal status. These were combined into a single tax obligation. The empire began to tax not just wealth, but potential. A field was expected to yield a specific amount of grain. A tenant farmer was expected to contribute a defined portion of labor or produce. The census, therefore, was not just demographic, it was economic. It mapped human and agricultural resources like a budget ledger. Imagine being a goat herder in Cappadocia. Your land, livestock, and labor would all be registered. Your obligations would remain fixed for years, and your children would likely inherit your tax roll. The burden was often crushing, but it gave the empire predictability. And predictability in Diocletian's mind meant survival. Control through permanence. One of the byproducts of Diocletian's system was a freezing of social mobility. To ensure stability and predictability, professions were made hereditary. Sons of soldiers were expected to serve. Sons of tax collectors became tax collectors. A shipbuilder's child became a shipbuilder. The empire had transformed into a vast machine in which people were, in essence, fixed cogs. This wasn't done out of cruelty. It was done to prevent loss of labor in key sectors. Diocletian and his successors believed that if people could leave their posts, their lands, trades, or duties, the imperial system would collapse into chaos. In effect, the empire was becoming more feudal in character, centuries before European feudalism took hold. This administrative fix would eventually define the late antique and early medieval social orders. The emperor as god, a political theology. Under Diocletian, the emperor was no longer merely first among equals princeps, but dominus et deus, lord and god. This shift in imperial ideology, part of the broader dominate period, was designed to reinforce authority. The emperor became a distant, elevated figure rarely seen, encircled by ritual, robed in silk and gold. Even addressing the emperor required genuflection, like a subject before a god. The court itself was a place of performance. Eunuchs, guards, heralds, petitioners, scribes. Every moment was choreographed. The imperial presence was no longer charismatic, it was constructed. Why? Because the bureaucracy depended on reverence. The edicts and laws that flowed from the imperial office had to be obeyed without question. The emperor had to be beyond reproach, infallible, or the entire structure unraveled. The divine emperor was not about religion, it was about control. The tension beneath the surface. While the administrative system Diocletian built had its benefits: efficiency, order, uniformity, it also bred resentment. Local elites, once autonomous civic leaders, were now pressed into the imperial mold. They were expected to pay taxes, manage cities, supply troops, and receive little thanks in return. Farmers groaned under fixed obligations. Merchants found themselves locked into bureaucratic categories that limited trade. The army was better provisioned, but it was also harder to escape from. Rebellion didn't vanish under Diocletian's reforms. It became more administrative: quiet tax revolts, falsified census records, desertion, bribery. The Roman people adjusted, resisted, and endured. The empire survived not because it was loved, but because it worked. Constantine and the legacy of the machine. When Constantine took sole control of the empire after defeating Licinius in 324 CE, he did not dismantle Diocletian's system. He perfected it. He retained the diocesan divisions. He maintained the civil-military separation of offices. He enforced hereditary professions. He even built a new imperial capital, Constantinople, far from Rome, just as Diocletian had ruled from Nicomedia. And Constantine introduced one major shift: Christianity. This was not just a religious decision, but a bureaucratic one. Christianity offered a hierarchy of bishops, deacons, and councils that mirrored the imperial bureaucracy. It gave the emperor a divine mandate and a new tool of unifying control. Church and state became partners in administration. Later emperors would codify this alliance, creating parallel systems of authority: bishops handling spiritual discipline and doctrine, imperial officials handling taxes and justice. It was Diocletian's machine, repurposed. How the Tetrarchy echoed through time. Though the Tetrarchy as a political structure collapsed swiftly, its administrative innovations endured. The division of the empire into Eastern and Western halves continued, eventually becoming permanent. The diocesan system evolved into the ecclesiastical dioceses of the Christian Church. The bureaucracy became the foundation of Byzantine governance: more rigid, more centralized, more reliant on scribes than senators. In a way, Diocletian's reforms outlived Rome itself. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, its administration was still operating in Ravenna, in Gaul, in North Africa, until Germanic kings slowly took its place. And in the East, Diocletian's system continued under emperors like Justinian, who codified Roman law in the 6th century, drawing directly from the legal traditions begun under Diocletian. The quiet power of paperwork. History remembers conquerors, revolutionaries, and martyrs, but it is often the quiet, unseen forces, ledgers, laws, and letters that shape the fate of empires. Diocletian understood this. He knew that Rome did not need another hero, it needed a functioning government. And so, instead of seeking glory through conquest, he built tax registers. He redrew provinces. He doubled the bureaucracy. He wore purple silk not to dazzle but to command respect. He retired not to escape but to prove that systems could outlive men. The Roman Empire after Diocletian was no longer the Rome of the Republic, nor of Caesar Augustus. It was a managerial state, sprawling, impersonal, efficient. In many ways, Diocletian's vision resembles modern states more than ancient empires. Rigid, orderly, obsessed with census data and revenue streams. He paved the way not just for Constantine, but for medieval kingdoms, absolute monarchies, and even modern bureaucracies. And so we're left with a curious final reflection. Can an empire, built on routine and record-keeping, endure longer than one built on heroism and charisma? And if so, which is more enduring, the memory of an emperor, or the system he left behind? Story 2. A New Rome in the East, the Rise of Nicomedia. If you imagine the Roman Empire as a great circle drawn on a parchment map, with Rome at its heart, then Diocletian's relocation to Nicomedia was nothing short of revolutionary. This city, nestled near the shores of the Propontis, today's Sea of Marmara, had long been a regional center. But under Diocletian, it became something more, a de facto capital of the Eastern Roman world. Quietly and without fanfare, the administrative soul of the empire began to drift away from Rome. This wasn't an emotional shift, it was logistical. The East was wealthier, more urban, more stable. Persia was always a threat. Egypt was vital for grain. Syria pulsed with trade. Nicomedia, perched on the edge of Asia and Europe, was the fulcrum of imperial needs. Let's walk now through its marble streets not as tourists, but as silent observers of bureaucracy at work. Why Nicomedia? Location, location, location. To understand why Diocletian chose Nicomedia, you need to look at the Roman Empire not as a unified state, but as a logistical puzzle. Rome, the eternal city, was a poor location for managing the frontiers. It was far from the Danube, far from the Euphrates, far from the richest provinces. Messages from Rome to Syria could take over 3 weeks. A Persian invasion could go unanswered for months. Nicomedia, by contrast, was ideally situated. It sat along major trade routes between Europe and Asia. It had access to the sea for rapid communication. It lay near the Bosphorus, allowing movement between Balkan military zones and Anatolia. It was close to major supply routes feeding the Danubian frontier and the Eastern legions. Diocletian wasn't abandoning Rome. He was solving a problem, one that had plagued emperors for decades. The new imperial court. When Diocletian established his residence in Nicomedia around 286 CE, he didn't do it as a conqueror. He arrived as a planner. Within years, Nicomedia transformed. Temples were restored, aqueducts improved, palaces rose. The city's bureaucratic presence exploded. Where once stood modest provincial offices, now stood imperial departments, staffed with scribes, accountants, notaries, and clerks. The Sacrum Consistorium, the sacred council, met in Nicomedia's halls, issuing edicts, drafting tax codes, managing grain supplies. This was not a symbolic court like that of old Rome. It was a working government, surrounded by layers of hierarchy. Magister officiorum, head of the imperial secretariat. Cum sacrarum largitionum, controller of the imperial treasury. Questor sacri palatia, chief legal advisor drafting laws. These men, largely unknown to history, processed the empire's decisions. They were the real administrators of Rome. And now they worked in Nicomedia. The city itself, marble and paperwork. Nicomedia had existed long before Diocletian. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, it had been a quiet city of Hellenistic roots, overshadowed by nearby Nicaea. Under Diocletian, it blossomed into a proto-capital. The city was rebuilt with a vast imperial palace complex, new defensive walls, a reconstructed harbor for military and grain transport, imperial offices, scrinia, where secretaries managed records, letters, and finances, official archives, where censuses, tax rolls, and military logs were stored, and perhaps most importantly, housing for the growing class of imperial administrators. For every general or governor, there were dozens of scribes, translators, clerks, and runners. Nicomedia became a city not of heroes, but of paper pushers, and that was exactly what Diocletian intended. A mobile empire, a fixed vision. The Tetrarchic system was designed for mobility. Each emperor had a residence, but none stayed in one place long. Diocletian moved between Nicomedia, Antioch, and Egypt. His colleagues rotated through Trier, Milan, Sirmium. Yet Nicomedia was more than a residence. It was a nerve center. When Diocletian launched his Persian campaign in 297 CE, the orders were issued from Nicomedia. When he reorganized the eastern provinces and issued tax reforms, the edicts were drafted and distributed from Nicomedia. Even after Diocletian's retirement, the city retained its elevated status. Galerius, ruling as Augustus in the east, continued to use Nicomedia as a primary base of operations. The imperial presence, even when absent, lingered in marble, mosaic, and ink. The persecution begins here. It was in Nicomedia, not Rome, that Diocletian began one of the most infamous episodes of his reign, the Great Persecution of Christians. On February 23, 303 CE, a date chosen for its religious symbolism, Diocletian ordered the destruction of the newly built Christian church in Nicomedia. The imperial edict was posted on the city walls the next morning. Christians in the army were dismissed, scriptures were confiscated, bishops arrested, churches seized. Why begin in Nicomedia? Because Nicomedia was no longer just a city, it was the imperial city of the East. And just as edicts had once been read in the Forum of Rome, they were now posted in the streets of Nicomedia. This was not merely a religious campaign. It was a bureaucratic one with registers, names, sentences, and quotas. It required clerical labor, and Nicomedia was where that labor was concentrated. Rome without Rome. The emergence of Nicomedia marked a mental shift in the Roman world. For centuries, Rome had been more than a city. It had been a symbol of power, tradition, and centrality. Even emperors who never ruled from there still paid it homage. They built baths, temples, and forums in its image. But Diocletian did not rule from Rome, and neither did his successors. Galerius, Constantine, Licinius all built their capitals elsewhere. Nicomedia's rise signaled a broader transformation. The empire no longer needed Rome to function. Rome remained the spiritual and historical capital. Nicomedia, and later Constantinople, became the administrative capitals. And that distinction between symbolic and practical capital would shape the empire's future. Constantine's arrival and departure. When Constantine defeated Licinius and unified the empire in 324 CE, he entered Nicomedia not as a guest, but as master. Yet he chose not to make it his permanent home. Instead, he founded a new capital nearby, Byzantium, soon renamed Constantinople. Why not Nicomedia? Some speculate it was a political decision, a desire to leave behind the memory of Diocletian and the persecutions. Others argue it was geographical. Byzantium had better natural defenses and sea access. But in truth, Constantinople was simply an extension of the idea that began in Nicomedia, an imperial capital in the east, separate from Rome, built for administration, not tradition. Nicomedia had set the precedent. What remains of Nicomedia? Today, little remains of ancient Nicomedia. Earthquakes, time, and conquest have erased most of its Roman layers. The modern city of Izmit in Turkey covers much of the ancient site. But the idea of Nicomedia lives on. In the administrative centers of Constantinople, in the eastward orientation of Roman governance, in the belief that power need not flow through Rome to be legitimate. Nicomedia was not the capital of an empire. It was the capital of an idea, the belief that an empire could be governed through routine, order, and distance. And that raises a quieter question, often overlooked. When did Rome stop being the heart of its empire and become just another city in its body? The rise of Nicomedia as a center of imperial administration did not occur in a vacuum. It was the product of centuries of eastward drift, a slow reorientation of Roman power from the mythos of the West toward the realities of the East. But no imperial capital, however meticulously built, was invincible. And as Nicomedia expanded into the de facto command post of the Eastern Roman world, it faced both natural and political tremors, forces that would test the city's role and its very survival. This section explores how Nicomedia functioned under the burden of empire, what it represented in the broader story of Roman governance, and how it coped with disasters both man-made and natural that shook its foundations. The day the earth shook. On September 24, 358 CE, Nicomedia was struck by a devastating earthquake. By that time, Diocletian was long dead. Constantine had come and gone. The city had faded from its administrative primacy, gradually replaced by the grandeur of Constantinople, but it still stood as a significant provincial and ecclesiastical hub. The earthquake destroyed homes, temples, churches, and civic buildings. It killed thousands, the death toll unrecorded but catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe walls crumbling like sand, fires breaking out, entire districts flattened. But beyond the physical destruction, the earthquake exposed a deeper truth: the fragility of permanence. Nicomedia had once symbolized the stability of Diocletian's reforms, bureaucratic endurance, administrative rationality, imperial discipline. And yet, in a single morning, stone and system alike were humbled. The bureaucracy reacts. What happened next was quintessentially Roman. Reports were dispatched to Constantinople. Relief funds were requested not from charity but through bureaucratic petition. The imperial treasury, tightly controlled, required documentation, population loss estimates, property damage assessments, grain shortfall projections. Scribes were sent to assess the damage. Surveyors marked out which buildings were beyond repair. Tax collectors recalculated fiscal quotas for the coming year. The Notitia Dignitatum, a key late imperial administrative record, still listed Nicomedia as the seat of a vicarious sub-imperial administrator overseeing Bithynia and parts of Asia Minor. This office did not vanish with the earthquake. It simply relocated temporarily to a nearby estate, continuing its function. This was the legacy of Diocletian's system. Even amidst rubble, the machine carried on. A city of dual identity. Throughout the 4th century, Nicomedia held a dual identity, no longer the primary capital, but still a city of consequence. Political, it remained a site of governance. The Eastern Emperor still used it occasionally, particularly before Constantinople's construction was complete. Religious. It had become a key Christian center, ironically, after being the launch point of Diocletian's great persecution. Nicomedia housed one of the earliest formal Christian bishoprics in the East. By the 330s, bishops from Nicomedia were participating in major councils, including Nicaea, 325 CE. In a historical twist, the very city that had once burned Christian scriptures now helped define Christian orthodoxy. This wasn't reconciliation, it was transformation. The empire and Nicomedia adapted to the faith of its new rulers. Eusebius and the record of persecution. Much of what we know about Nicomedia during the Tetrarchy comes not from Roman historians, but from Eusebius of Caesarea, a Christian bishop and writer. Eusebius described in almost clinical detail the start of the great persecution in Nicomedia. He wrote of soldiers destroying churches, of Christian officials being stripped of rank, of tortures ordered by edict. Yet even in his account, we glimpse the administrative mindset behind the persecution. Christians were systematically removed from civil posts. Sacrifices to the old gods became a requirement for public employment. Lists were compiled, names of Christians, their positions, their offenses. This wasn't mob violence, it was bureaucratic exclusion, and it was orchestrated from Nicomedia. That makes the city's later Christian transformation all the more striking. Between East and West, the city's strategic role. Even after its political importance waned, Nicomedia remained essential for one reason: its location. It was the first stop on the road between Constantinople and the Anatolian interior. Its roads fed into the major routes towards Syria, Cappadocia, and Armenia. This made it a staging ground for military logistics, supplying eastern campaigns, hosting troop rotations. Imperial travel. Emperors, bishops, and bureaucrats passed through regularly. Trade, linking the Aegean and Pontic seas through overland connections. As a result, the city maintained an unusually high degree of infrastructure investment well into the 5th century, repaired aqueducts, paved roads, and even restored forum spaces. It was no longer the seat of empire, but it was still part of the empire's nervous system. The shadow of Constantinople. By the mid-300s, Nicomedia had a new neighbor. Constantinople, the city Constantine built atop ancient Byzantium. Just 100 kilometers away across the Sea of Marmara, this new capital glittered with palaces, forums, basilicas, and an imperial court that mirrored and surpassed Rome itself. In some ways, Constantinople stole Nicomedia's future. The civil service, the court, the money all flowed east, just across the Bosphorus. And yet, Nicomedia persisted. It became a satellite of the new capital, a place for secondary offices, overflow storage, military encampments, and workshops. It played the role that Ravenna once played to Rome. The irony is sharp. Diocletian never intended to found a rival to Rome, but in elevating Nicomedia, he planted the seed of the Eastern Roman Empire's eventual center of gravity, not Rome, but Constantinople. Civic identity and rebuilding. After the earthquake of 358 CE, and again after another major shock in the early 5th century, Nicomedia was rebuilt. The funds came slowly. Imperial priorities had shifted. But the city's curial class, those local elites responsible for maintaining civic structures, led the efforts. Temples were repurposed as churches. Public baths were restored, though more modest. The imperial palace, now mostly vacant, became a source of stone for new construction. The city shrank in grandeur but not in function. Administrative offices operated from smaller buildings. Churches took on more civic responsibility, caring for the poor, distributing grain, organizing charity. What began as a city of emperors had become a city of administrators and bishops. And that transformation, subtle but profound, reflected the broader Christianization of the state, a mirror of the empire's shift. In many ways, Nicomedia became a mirror of the late empire. It retained imperial form, but adapted to Christian substance. It preserved Roman roads and offices, but filled them with new purposes. It lost its political primacy, but kept its logistical and spiritual role. By the time of Emperor Theodosius I, R 379–395 CE, Nicomedia had become more of a regional node than a capital. But it had left its mark not through conquest or fame, but through quiet governance. That is Diocletian's legacy in miniature. A whisper, not a trumpet. Unlike Rome, Nicomedia did not fill the pages of epic poetry. Unlike Constantinople, it wasn't immortalized in marble for centuries, but it represented a moment in history when pragmatism triumphed over tradition. It was, for a brief but pivotal moment, the heart of a new kind of empire, one defined not by its monuments or oratory, but by scrolls and seals, ledgers and laws, posts and pensions. Nicomedia was not the Rome of Cicero or Caesar. It was the Rome of clerks and codes. And so we're left with a quieter, subtler question one not often asked. Can a capital truly shape an empire if no one remembers it as such? If you were to walk the streets of Nicomedia in the 6th centuries, after Diocletian's reforms, after Constantine's rise, and after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, you might not recognize the former capital. There would be no grand imperial court, no purple-robed Augustus issuing edicts, no more edicts posted on marble walls by imperial scribes. Instead, there would be markets, churches, and the steady hum of local administration. Monks would replace magistrates. Bishops would occupy once secular basilicas. Nicomedia had faded not into ruin, but into routine, a city no longer extraordinary, yet still functioning. And this transformation from imperial capital to provincial city tells a story not of collapse, but of adaptation. Byzantine reincarnation, from capital to diocese. By the time of Emperor Justinian, R 527–565 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire, now called the Byzantine Empire by modern historians, had undergone immense transformation. Constantinople had long since eclipsed all rivals. Rome was a memory, and the West a fragmented patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. Yet Nicomedia still appeared in official documents as the seat of a bishopric under the ecclesiastical province of Bithynia, as a diocesan center responsible for collecting taxes and managing imperial property, as a logistical node for Eastern military movements and Anatolian grain supplies. Its once grand palaces were mostly gone, but the city functioned within the empire's matrix not as a centerpiece, but as a supporting beam. This fate, in many ways, was more reflective of Roman endurance than the stories of emperors and conquests. Nicomedia remained because it adapted to the needs of the state. Christianization and the death of pagan memory. As Christianity became the dominant and eventually sole state religion, Nicomedia's pagan past faded deliberately. Temples were either demolished or repurposed. Statues of emperors were replaced by mosaics of saints. The memory of Diocletian was preserved only in religious polemic as a persecutor, a villain, not a reformer. Local Christian communities associated the city not with administrative reform, but with martyrdom. The names of saints and bishops replaced those of emperors and magistrates. In sermons and hagiographies, Nicomedia became known as the place where St. George was rumored to have been martyred, though his historicity is debated. St. Anthimus, bishop of Nicomedia, was executed under Diocletian. Countless unnamed Christians suffered imprisonment and torture. The bureaucratic city had become a spiritual battleground, one remembered more for persecution than policy. Earthquakes, fires, and loss. The eastern Mediterranean was, and remains, seismically active. Nicomedia suffered repeated earthquakes in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Each time it was rebuilt never to its former grandeur, but enough to maintain civic life. Public works were repaired in piecemeal fashion, water supply restored, churches rebuilt using recycled stone from imperial structures. By the 7th century, Nicomedia faced Arab raids, economic contraction, and shifting trade routes. Its decline was slow, marked not by a single catastrophe, but by a series of diminutions. The imperial bureaucracy thinned. Grain convoys rerouted through other ports. New administrative centers in Anatolia drew resources away. It didn't fall, it simply shrank. This perhaps is how most cities die in the ancient world, not in flames but in footnotes. A city of administrators, not heroes. What makes Nicomedia unique in Roman history is that its story is not centered on famous deeds or dramatic conquests. It was never a battlefield. Few grand orations were delivered there. Its walls weren't immortalized in epic poetry. Instead, Nicomedia's legacy is built on paperwork, policy, and routine. Imperial edicts copied by scribes. Tax scrolls recorded and archived. Court proceedings managed by notaries and legal clerks. Grain quotas calculated by regional officials. Persecutions, cruel as they were, coordinated by administrative command. This was a city whose greatest power lay in its ability to function quietly, efficiently, and reliably. In that sense, Nicomedia was more revolutionary than Rome ever was. It was the prototype for cities designed not for glory, but for governance. Echoes in Constantinople. When Constantine founded Constantinople in 324 CE, he incorporated many of the lessons learned from Nicomedia. A city oriented toward administration and military logistics. Built on the frontier between continents. Designed for imperial access to both east and west. Staffed with trained bureaucrats, many of whom had experience in Nicomedia's civil service. Even the court ceremonial of Constantinople, the layers of ritual, the emphasis on protocol, the structure of the imperial household had its roots in the Tetrarchic system that once ruled from Nicomedia. Though Nicomedia faded, its DNA lived on in marble, ink, and ceremony just a day's sail across the sea. Modern shadows, the forgotten capital. Today, Izmit, the modern city atop ancient Nicomedia, is a bustling Turkish industrial center. Factories hum where palaces once stood. Cars race over roads first laid by Roman engineers. Very little of Diocletian's city remains visible. The harbor is silted over. The palace is gone, likely used as a quarry centuries ago. The forums and temples lie beneath layers of later construction. Archaeologists occasionally uncover pieces, inscriptions, column fragments, foundations of thermal baths. But to the average passerby, Nicomedia is invisible. It exists now mostly in academic monographs, footnotes, and historical reconstructions, a city that once ruled the Roman East, now remembered by few. What remains? But let's not mistake absence for irrelevance. The essence of Nicomedia was never marble or gold. It was the sound of scribes dipping pens into ink, the rhythm of messengers galloping along paved roads, the silence of clerks balancing ledgers by candlelight, the discipline of provincial governors sending reports to the imperial office. Those rhythms, quiet and procedural, were the heartbeat of the Roman state, and they did not die with Nicomedia. They migrated to Constantinople, to Ravenna, to Antioch, to Baghdad, to Paris. Every city that has served as an administrative capital since has borrowed consciously or not from what Nicomedia once was. A final reflection. As we leave Nicomedia behind, fading into the mists of administrative memory, we're left with a question that history rarely asks. Is greatness only found in what is remembered, or can it live quietly in systems, routines, and the things that keep empires from falling apart? Nicomedia was not a city of monuments. It was a city of maintenance, and in that perhaps it was more important than we remember. Story 3. Tax Reform and the Burden of Empire. Somewhere in the early 4th century countryside, perhaps in the flat fields of Egypt, or among the vine-covered hills of Gaul, a farmer wakes to find a stranger at his door. He isn't a soldier or a priest. He's an imperial assessor, carrying scrolls, wax tablets, and a stylus. He's here to count how much land the farmer owns, what kind of crops he grows, how many animals live on the property, how many sons and daughters might be old enough to labor or pay taxes. He isn't here to take anything. Not yet. He's here to record, to calculate, and to prepare the burden that will soon be imposed. Welcome to the world of Diocletian's tax reform, a story not of conquest or coronation, but of inventory, paperwork, and the quiet mechanics of state survival. Why reform the tax system? By the end of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire faced a crisis that could not be solved with legions or laws. Its revenue was collapsing. Years of civil war, military inflation, and population movement had destabilized the fiscal core of the empire. Coins were debased. Inflation was rampant. Tax arrears mounted. Provinces failed to meet their obligations. Entire towns begged to be excused from civic responsibilities. The empire had always relied on a mix of in-kind taxation, grain, livestock, textiles, and monetary payments. But the system had become erratic, with wide regional disparities and widespread evasion. Diocletian saw the problem with characteristic clarity. The state could not function without a predictable stream of resources. He didn't need more money. He needed order. The capitatio-eugatio system, taxing people and land. The centerpiece of Diocletian's reform was the capitatio-eugatio, an intricate and regionally adjusted method for calculating taxes. It was a fusion of two concepts. Capitatio, a tax on individuals or laborers' heads. Eugatio, a tax on land. Eugum equals a unit of land, literally a yoke. Instead of a flat tax or arbitrary levy, Diocletian's system linked the land and its labor force into a single taxable unit. It was detailed, complicated, regionally adapted, and at least on paper fair. Officials were tasked with surveying the land, measuring its size, fertility, water access, counting the people, assessing labor capacity, age, and productivity, recording fixed values, how much grain a field should yield, how much wool a shepherd should provide. Once calculated, these assessments remained valid for 5 years, the period between each census cycle. Indictio. It was, in essence, a budgetary projection, set in stone and enforced with imperial authority. Census as ritual and requirement. The census, once a Roman tradition for measuring citizen wealth in the Republic, now became a bureaucratic juggernaut. Census officials, known as censitors, moved from village to village, armed with wax tablets and accompanied by guards and local scribes. Their task was to ensure nothing was left uncounted. A vineyard had to be measured. A plow ox had to be weighed and aged. Even a widow's household could be taxed based on her son's future labor. People often tried to hide assets, concealing livestock, moving children, falsifying field yields. The penalty? Fines, confiscation, in extreme cases forced labor. But more than punishment, what the census imposed was a sense of fiscal permanence. Once something was recorded, it was expected. If your fields yielded 40 modi of grain this year, you were expected to provide the same next year, even if floods, pests, or drought intervened. In kind and inescapable. One of the most important features of Diocletian's tax system was the emphasis on in-kind taxation. Rather than demand gold or silver, which could fluctuate wildly in value, the state preferred grain, oil, cloth, and meet the necessities of army provisioning and state administration. Every region had specific quotas. Egypt provided grain for Constantinople. Syria sent linen and glass. Africa shipped olive oil and ceramics. Illyricum contributed timber and horses. These deliveries were coordinated through a complex logistics network of depots, warehouses, and official transport routes known as the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and freight system. Tax wasn't something you sent, it was something you delivered. Burden on the curials, local elites under pressure. If Diocletian's reforms were a machine, then the curials were the gears. The curials were the local landowning elites, members of town councils, curiae, responsible for collecting taxes from their communities. They were the empire's middle managers, part public official, part scapegoat. Their responsibilities included collecting the full tax quota from their region, covering any shortfall from their own pockets, maintaining census records, and enforcing labor obligations, repairing roads, aqueducts, and markets. At first, this seemed like an honor-a role of civic pride. But over time, as imperial quotas rose and local economies declined, the curial role became a trap. Many tried to escape the class entirely by becoming priests or bishops, exempt from curial duties, by forging documents to show poverty, by fleeing to rural estates or distant provinces. The state responded with new laws making curial status hereditary and binding. You could no longer resign. Your son would take your place. The class that once formed the proud civic core of the empire had become its fiscal prisoners. The Edict on Maximum Prices, 301 CE. Around the same time as his tax reforms, Diocletian issued another famous economic measure, the Edict on Maximum Prices. This enormous inscription, posted in towns across the empire, listed maximum allowable prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat to wine, from bricklaying to haircuts. Why? Inflation had ravaged the empire. Soldiers and merchants demanded more coins. Provinces couldn't afford basic goods. The government hoped to stabilize the economy by setting strict price ceilings. Examples included wheat, 100 denarii per modius. Wine, 30 denarii per sextarius. A day laborer's wage, 25 denarii. A schoolteacher's monthly fee, 50 denarii. Violations were punishable by death. The edict was a bureaucrat's dream, an attempt to tame market chaos with centralized control, but in practice it failed. Goods vanished from markets. Black markets flourished. Merchants refused to sell at fixed rates. Enforcement was patchy. Eventually, the edict was quietly ignored, but its existence shows just how deeply Diocletian believed that structure and numbers could contain instability. What it meant for ordinary people. For the average Roman, a farmer, a weaver, a miller, Diocletian's reforms didn't feel like reforms. They felt like constraints. Life became more predictable, but also less free. You could no longer easily move to avoid taxes. Your children inherited your social role. Your production was tied to quotas, not demand. Your town's debts became your responsibility. And yet the empire functioned. Frontiers were held, grain moved, cities were fed, temples were maintained. The machine, though heavy, turned. This was Diocletian's vision. Not fairness, not prosperity, but survival through discipline. A cold kind of stability. In time, these tax reforms outlasted Diocletian himself. Constantine kept the system. Later emperors refined it. The indictio cycle, the 5-year census and tax term, became the heartbeat of Byzantine fiscal life. Even centuries later, when Arab armies conquered Roman provinces, they retained parts of the Roman tax apparatus because it worked. Diocletian had not created joy, he had created efficiency. And in a world of political chaos and military threats, that was enough. So as we end this section, consider a question that few rulers ever dared to ask. Can an empire be held together not by love or loyalty, but by ledgers, quotas, and census scrolls? By the time Diocletian left power in 305 CE, the reforms he initiated had already begun to calcify. What had started as a series of temporary administrative solutions were quickly becoming permanent structures, not just within the bureaucracy, but within society itself. The Roman Empire, once a patchwork of flexible provincial arrangements and civic freedoms, was now turning into something else. A system defined by rigid categories, hereditary obligations, and unbending quotas. This wasn't a tyranny of violence, it was a tyranny of order. In this section, we'll examine how Diocletian's fiscal and occupational reforms slowly reshaped Roman society, and how they revealed the tension between stability and human freedom. Frozen in place, hereditary professions and social lockdown. To ensure tax reliability, Diocletian's administration did more than count people and fields. It began to bind people to place and profession. If taxes were based on expected production, whether of grain, wool, or labor, the imperial government needed certainty about who would produce what and where. This led to a critical change in Roman law, professional heredity. By the early 4th century, certain occupations became legally hereditary. Sons of soldiers were required to join the army. Sons of bakers became bakers. Sons of shipbuilders were tied to imperial docks. Sons of coloni, tenant farmers, inherited their father's lease and their fiscal obligations. This policy extended even to seemingly mundane roles: brickmakers, mule drivers, lime producers, leather workers. If the empire relied on your labor, it ensured it would continue through you, your children, and your grandchildren. Mobility, once a hallmark of Roman life, became a legal liability. The colony and the proto-serfdom. One of the most enduring social effects of these reforms was the evolution of the colony class. Originally, a colonist was simply a tenant farmer, someone who worked a landowner's estate in exchange for a share of the produce. But after Diocletian, and especially under Constantine and later emperors, the colonists became increasingly tied to the land. New laws required coloni to remain on their assigned plot. They could not leave without permission. Their names were recorded in tax registries. If the land was sold, their obligations transferred to the new owner. By the 5th century, coloni could be bought and sold with the land not as slaves, but as bound laborers. The difference was largely legal, not practical. This wasn't yet medieval serfdom, but the line was being drawn. Diocletian didn't intend to create a caste society, but his tax reforms, in pursuit of fiscal certainty, had begun to lay its foundation. Resistance and evasion, the everyday rebellion. Not everyone accepted their new place quietly. Across the empire, people resisted not with weapons but with avoidance. Peasants fled census districts and hid in forests or mountains. Curials falsified ledgers to reduce quotas or shift blame. Soldiers deserted rather than see their sons conscripted. Artisans sought ordination into the clergy to escape fiscal duty. In response, the imperial government enacted increasingly harsh laws. Runaway coloni were hunted down and returned to their land. Curials who refused office were fined or imprisoned. Tax collectors were empowered with judicial authority to enforce compliance. But enforcement was uneven. In distant provinces, imperial edicts were filtered through layers of governors, scribes, and local elites. Some resisted, some exploited the system, some simply ignored it. Diocletian's machine was powerful, but it was not omnipotent. Tax burden and provincial variation. Despite efforts to create a uniform system, tax burdens were not equal across the empire. Certain provinces, especially in the east, were far more productive. Egypt provided enormous grain surpluses. Syria and Asia Minor contributed textiles, dyes, and artisanal goods. North Africa sent oil and ceramics in massive quantities. Western provinces such as Britain, Gaul, and Spain were more heavily taxed per capita to compensate for their lower agricultural yields and higher military demands. This created resentment. In Gaul, uprisings flared among overburdened rural communities. In North Africa, wealthy landowners tried to exempt themselves from communal quotas. In Italy, the ancient privileges of Rome's senatorial class continued to erode under imperial pressure. The myth of fairness that all regions shared the burden equally was crucial to imperial ideology, but the reality was uneven and often unjust. The military and tax nexus. Perhaps nowhere were Diocletian's tax reforms more vital than in the realm of military logistics. The empire's standing army, numbering between 400,000 and 500,000 troops, required over 100,000 tons of grain per year, tens of thousands of tunics, sandals, and belts, horses, wagons, tents, weapons, and more, salaries for officers and donatives for loyalty. Diocletian's system ensured these were provided in kind, from tax revenues. Every province contributed not just money, but resources, delivered to state-run storehouses and military depots. Military roads were maintained under fiscal mandate. Imperial way stations, mansions, and mutations were stocked and staffed as part of regional obligations. The result: a logistical empire in motion. Soldiers could march across thousands of miles and receive food, gear, and transport without ever needing to purchase it. But this required exacting discipline at every level of the tax system. One missing shipment in Cappadocia could delay a campaign in Armenia. One miscalculated grain quota in Egypt could starve Constantinople. The empire didn't march on valor. It marched on spreadsheets, though made of parchment and wax. The role of the church, a fiscal shelter. As the Christian church grew in prominence during the 4th century, it gradually became a safe harbor for those trying to escape fiscal obligation. Bishops and clergy were tax-exempt. Church lands were often protected from direct imperial taxation. Those who joined religious orders could leave behind hereditary professions. By the time of Constantine, church estates began to grow not only from donations, but from those fleeing imperial expectations. Former curials sought refuge in monasteries. Sons of soldiers donned the cassock. Artisans gave up their trade for clerical protection. This created tension between the church and the state. The empire issued laws limiting the number of clergy. Bishops were told not to ordain runaway curials. Property transfers to the church were scrutinized and sometimes reversed. The church offered spiritual salvation, but increasingly, it also offered economic relief. In Diocletian's system, this was a flaw. In later centuries, it became a feature of post-Roman society. Bureaucracy becomes destiny. Perhaps the most lasting consequence of Diocletian's tax reform wasn't economic but psychological. The Roman world had always prized status mobility, the idea that wealth, valor, or service could elevate a man. Under the Republic, a plebeian could become a consul. Under Augustus, a provincial could become a senator. But by the 4th century, under the shadow of Diocletian's structure, the empire now told its subjects, "You are what we say you are. You live where you are recorded. You do the work your father did. You pay what the register says, no more, no less. Freedom was traded for predictability, and in the grand calculus of imperial stability, predictability often wins. A system that could not bend. The most tragic irony of Diocletian's system was that it could not adapt to failure. Because tax quotas were fixed in advance, based on projected productivity, the system could not easily adjust for famine, drought, flood, war, disease. If a village was wiped out by plague, the neighboring villages still owed the same quota. If a harvest failed, payment was still required either in kind or through confiscation of other goods. Instead of easing pressure, the state often tightened enforcement during crises, believing that leniency would encourage evasion. This rigidity was both the system's strength and its weakness. It ensured continued function but eroded resilience. And so we return to an unsettling but essential question. If survival requires the sacrifice of freedom, how long can that survival truly last? The sun never set on Diocletian's tax system, not because it endured unchanged forever, but because its core principles lived on in empires that outlasted Rome itself. By the time the Western Roman Empire officially fell, in 476 CE, Diocletian had been dead for over 170 years. And yet, across vast swaths of former imperial territory from North Africa to the Balkans, from Egypt to Gaul, the Capitatio-Eugatio system still quietly functioned. It is in this quiet persistence in dusty archives, in the scribbles of tired curials, in the counted goats and measured vineyards that we find the true legacy of Diocletian's reforms. His was not the legacy of triumph or glory. It was the legacy of bureaucratic survival. From Rome to Byzantium, a fiscal continuity. The Eastern Roman Empire, known to us today as the Byzantine Empire, carried forward Diocletian's vision well into the medieval period. The indiction cycle, a 15-year tax schedule rooted in Diocletian's census reforms, became the chronological framework for much of Byzantine administration. The Iugum remained a unit of taxation, not always land, but now generalized to represent a total economic burden. Curials gradually transformed into local fiscal agents, often appointed by the central government rather than self-elected. Tax records from Egypt and Syria, well into the 600 CE, show remarkable continuity in formats and expectations. Even in Justinian's codex in the 6th century, references to Diocletian-era fiscal structures abound as if they had always been part of imperial law. This was the hidden triumph of Diocletian. His tax reforms became the fiscal DNA of the empire. Barbarian kings and Roman tax scrolls. After the disintegration of centralized Roman power in the West, many so-called barbarian kingdoms, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Vandals in Africa, adopted Roman administrative practices. Why? Because they worked. The Ostrogothic kingdom under Theodoric the Great continued to use Roman tax assessments and even retained Roman officials in key posts. In Gaul, the Merovingian kings adapted imperial fiscal districts for their own revenue collection. In North Africa, the Vandal kingdom kept elements of the Roman tax ledger system to provision its fleet and garrisons. These Germanic rulers were warlords by origin, but they quickly became managers by necessity, and Diocletian had already written the manual. Taxation and the Christian state. As Christianity became the state religion of the empire under Constantine and his successors, the tax system absorbed and influenced the evolving role of the church. Churches and monasteries, once on the fringes of society, became landholders. They collected rent, paid taxes sometimes, and employed scribes. In many cities, Bishops took on civic responsibilities once handled by curials, distributing grain to the poor, repairing aqueducts and walls, mediating tax disputes between towns and imperial agents. But tensions simmered beneath the surface. The imperial state often clashed with ecclesiastical privilege. Laws were issued to limit church tax exemptions. Bishops were told not to shelter runaway taxpayers or curials. Wealthy individuals transferred property to the church to avoid assessment, leading to imperial confiscations. The church, born in persecution, now stood in negotiation with the very machinery that had once oppressed it. Justice or efficiency, the unchanging trade-off. Diocletian's system was not designed to be just. It was designed to be functional, and therein lies one of history's most enduring dilemmas. Should a state be fair or should it function? His answer was clear: predictability over fairness, quotas over flexibility, structure over compassion. This did not mean cruelty was the goal, but efficiency was, even at the expense of hardship. If your fields failed, the tax quota remained. If you lost your livestock to raiders, your obligation held. If your son fled military service, your town was punished. The goal was survival, not mercy. This may strike the modern listener as cold, but in an age where fiscal collapse meant imperial collapse, Diocletian's choices reflected pragmatic necessity. The long-term impact on Roman society. Diocletian's reforms did more than shape economies. They redefined society. Cities lost autonomy. Once proud municipal governments became extensions of imperial bureaucracy. Elites became administrators. The curial class, once civic benefactors, were now fiscal functionaries. Occupations solidified. Roman society, which once thrived on ambition and flexibility, became stratified with movement discouraged or criminalized. The rural-urban divide widened. Farmers, tied to land, became less mobile, while imperial agents grew more detached from local realities. State violence became administrative. The empire no longer needed mass executions to ensure compliance, it needed ledgers, fines, and quotas. Roman identity shifted, no longer centered on citizenship, culture, or even loyalty to the emperor. It now revolved around one's role in the fiscal web. You were what you owed. When the system failed, and yet even the most rigid system can crack. By the 6th century, natural disasters, pandemics, and invasions began to shake the foundations of the system. The plague of Justinian, starting 541 CE, wiped out millions across the Mediterranean. With the labor force decimated, tax quotas became unbearable. Repeated wars with the Sassanid Persians disrupted supply lines and emptied treasuries. Slavic and Avar incursions into the Balkans rendered entire fiscal districts ungovernable. The arrival of Islamic armies in the 7th century severed Egypt and Syria, the empire's grain and tax heartlands, from Constantinople. The imperial response. In many cases, instead of adjusting quotas downward, it increased pressure on remaining provinces. Eventually, this rigidity led to widespread flight from the land, local revolts, and a deeper reliance on the church and local magnates. The system that once ensured imperial survival now accelerated its fragmentation. But did it work? In one sense, Diocletian's reforms worked beyond expectation. The Roman state survived for over 1,000 years in the East after his death. His administrative templates influenced Islamic tax systems, medieval European monarchies, and Ottoman land tenure. His census methods echoed in Carolingian, Fatimid, and Byzantine governance. The very concept of a state-run bureaucracy separate from the person of the ruler was his great innovation. He didn't save the Roman Empire. He changed what it meant to govern. The hidden face of empire. It's tempting to measure empire by its wars and emperors, by its statues and speeches. But empires are also built by clerks, surveyors, grain measurers, and exchequers, the ones who counted rather than conquered. They drew maps no general ever saw. They knew names no poet ever praised. They stamped seals on parchment that outlasted dynasties. Diocletian understood this, and in the most unheroic way imaginable, he reshaped history. Final reflection. So we return to a scene not of marble columns or battlefield triumphs, but of a small, tired official hunched over a ledger by candlelight. He is copying tax records. He is calculating grain quotas. He is sealing wax scrolls. No one will remember his name. But because of him and thousands like him, the empire continued. What then is the true foundation of a civilization? The glory of its conquests or the weight of its ledgers? Story 4. The military frontier life along the Danube and Euphrates. On a cold morning along the Danube River, a Roman soldier rises before sunrise. His unit is posted at a castellum, a small fort built to monitor the river crossing. The fort isn't grand, just squared stone walls, a gatehouse, a few wooden towers, and cramped barracks. Far to the east, another soldier stands atop a watchtower near the Euphrates, scanning the dry horizon for any movement. Behind him lie the fertile fields of Roman Mesopotamia. Before him, the long shadow of the Persian Empire. These two men, separated by thousands of miles, serve the same empire but live in entirely different worlds. Their duty is the same: hold the line. In this section, we explore the structure, daily rhythms, and strategic realities of life along Rome's two most critical military frontiers. The Danube, a fluid frontier. Stretching over 2,800 kilometers from the Black Forest to the Black Sea, the Danube River marked the northern boundary of the Roman Empire for centuries. Its course wound through modern-day Germany, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, and Romania, and beyond its waters lay the lands of the Germanic tribes, Sarmatians, and later, Goths. To Rome, the Danube was both barrier and bridge. It could be crossed in winter when frozen. It could be forded by raiders during spring thaws. It facilitated trade as well as invasion. Thus, Rome fortified the Danube not with a wall, but with a ribbon of forts, watchtowers, roads, and depots known as the Danubian limes. These weren't isolated garrisons. They were part of an integrated defensive system, often within line of sight of one another, and staffed by limitan, frontier troops trained for static defense and patrols. Comitatenses, mobile field units stationed deeper inland, ready to reinforce weak points. Local militia and auxiliaries, often recruited from nearby communities, including non-Roman populations. The Euphrates, a line against Persia. The Euphrates frontier was a different beast entirely. Here, Rome did not face scattered tribes but a unified rival state. The Sassanid Persian Empire, wealthy, organized, and aggressive. War between Rome and Persia was almost cyclical, erupting every few decades over disputed cities and border provinces. The key Roman strategy along the Euphrates was deep defense. Rather than building a single wall, Rome constructed layered zones of fortification, centering around key cities such as Europos, a multicultural garrison town known for its synagogue, Christian church, and Persian graffiti. Nisibis, a commercial and military hub that changed hands multiple times. Edessa and Carrhae, fortified outposts on the edge of open desert. Forts here were often large, stone-built, and accompanied by civilian populations, families of soldiers, merchants, local farmers, and displaced peoples from deeper within the empire. The Euphrates frontier was not only militarized, it was urbanized. Daily life at the edge. To live on the frontier was to live in tension, not constant violence but constant readiness. Soldiers on the Danube or Euphrates followed structured routines. Morning drills and patrols. Maintenance of weapons and equipment. Inspection of supplies and rations. Guard duty along walls or riverbanks. But they were also farmers, blacksmiths, and builders. Roman forts were often self-sufficient communities, growing their own food, repairing their own gear, and bartering with nearby villages. Inscriptions from these sites scratched into stone, painted on walls, or etched onto potsherds reveal a surprisingly mundane world. Complaints about poor pay or bad food. Notes about love affairs or gambling debts. Religious dedications to Jupiter, Mithras, or local deities. Requests for leave or petitions to higher commanders. The edge of empire was not glamorous, but it was deeply human. The role of civilians and veterans. The frontier was not just a military zone, it was also a settlement frontier. Many forts had vici, small civilian towns clustered outside the walls. These were home to veterans who had settled nearby with land grants. Traders selling tool, textiles, wine, and spices. Women and children, despite regulations barring official marriage during service. Artisans, potters, smiths, bakers who kept the garrison supplied. When soldiers retired after 25 years of service, many remained in the region, reinforcing Rome's hold on the frontier. Over generations, some frontier zones became creolized, a mix of Roman, local, and foreign culture. Names in tomb inscriptions reflect this blend: Latin, Greek, Gothic, Aramaic, even Persian. To be Roman here was less about blood and more about function and loyalty. Infrastructure as defense. Rome's frontiers weren't defended just by men, but by infrastructure. Roads like the Via Triana or Via Militaris allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies. Bridges, some temporary, others permanent, linked strategic crossing points. Depots Horia stored grain, arms, and winter gear. Signal towers relayed visual messages via smoke and fire across vast distances. The Notitia Dignitatum, a late Roman administrative document, meticulously listed each fort, its unit, and commanding officer, a bureaucratic attempt to maintain order across thousands of kilometers. In times of peace, this infrastructure was used for trade and migration. In times of war, it turned the frontier into a defensive web. Threats from without and within. The frontiers were rarely stable for long. On the Danube, waves of Gothic migrations, spurred by pressure from the Huns, tested the limits of Roman diplomacy and military strength. Along the Euphrates, the Persians launched regular campaigns to seize fortresses, challenge Roman dominance, or raid for prestige. Frontier populations sometimes grew restless, especially when Rome failed to pay soldiers on time or protect local communities. Even more dangerous was assimilation. Roman commanders often made treaties with local tribal leaders, granting them land or titles in exchange for loyalty. Over time, these groups, once considered barbarians, gained footholds inside the imperial frontier. It was a pragmatic policy, but it carried long-term risks. The psychological frontier. For Roman officials, the frontier was more than a military zone. It was a mental boundary, a place where order met disorder, Rome met non-Rome. Maps like the Tabula Peutingeriana, a medieval copy of a Roman road map, depict the empire as a network of roads leading from Rome outward, with the edges marked not by lines, but by symbols, fortresses, rivers, and ominous notations. To live on the frontier was to negotiate identity. Were you Roman because you lived in a Roman fort? Because you spoke Latin? Because you paid taxes, served in the army, or wore Roman sandals? Many people on the frontier were hybrids, born to Roman fathers and local mothers, educated in Latin but worshiping local gods, serving Rome while trading with enemy peoples. The frontier blurred lines legally, culturally, and personally. The Tetrarchy's frontier reforms. Under Diocletian, the frontiers were reinforced with new forts, reorganized command structures, and regional defense zones. He assigned military commanders with specific diocesan responsibilities. Civil and military powers were separated in an attempt to curb corruption and maintain control. Limitana units were often settled soldiers, given land near their stations to farm between deployments, a model blending soldier and settler. It was a cost-saving measure, but it also localized the defense of empire, reducing Rome's need to move troops over long distances. These reforms, like his tax measures, prioritized predictability over flexibility, and for a time they worked. So we end this section not with a siege or a battle, but with an ordinary observation. What happens to an empire when the lines meant to keep enemies out begin to define who belongs within? Imagine standing in the long shadow of a Roman watchtower as the sun dips below the wooded hills beyond the Danube, or walking along a stony road in the Syrian steppe, lined with flat-roofed homes, soldiers drilling in the dust, and the ever-present hum of merchants shouting prices. These were not places of spectacle, but places of subtle intensity, where survival, loyalty, and identity were constantly negotiated. In this section, we examine how life along the Roman frontier, particularly during and after Diocletian's reign, shaped not just the empire's defensive posture, but its social fabric, military culture, and eventual transformation. The Tetrarchic shift, fortified boundaries and flexible forces. Under the Tetrarchy, the military frontier was rethought. It was no longer enough to simply build static forts and garrison legions. The threats were changing. Germanic confederations along the Danube were growing in size and ambition. Sassanid Persia was organizing large professional armies, capable of prolonged campaigns. Internal rebellions and usurpers sometimes came from within the frontier zones themselves. Diocletian and his fellow tetrarchs recognized that defending the empire meant layering their strategy. The solution was threefold. Fortify the border zones, limes with small outposts, watchtowers, and fortified supply depots. Station limitane lower status, semi-permanent frontier soldiers in these posts. Retain mobile field armies, comitatances in the rear provinces, ready to respond quickly to invasions or unrest. This created a tiered defense model, where the frontier absorbed initial pressure and the mobile units responded with precision. It was not glamorous, but it worked for a while. The role of limitane, settler soldiers of the border. The limitane are often misunderstood. They were not elite legionaries. They were, in many ways, local soldiers, tied to land and community. Most were recruited from the regions they defended. Over time, their service became semi-hereditary sons joining their father's units, learning the terrain, the rhythms, the threats. They were granted plots of land, often near or within the fort. Reduced salaries, supplemented by farming. Tax exemptions or reductions. Lower chances of reassignment, meaning they stayed close to their families. This created a class of frontier loyalists not Roman in blood perhaps, but deeply Roman in function. They were the buffer between empire and uncertainty. Frontier towns, a world of hybrids. Across both the Danube and Euphrates lines, Roman military presence catalyzed the growth of settlements that blended cultures. In Duriaropos, Jewish synagogues, Christian churches, and pagan temples stood side by side. In Carnuntum and Vindobona, modern Vienna, Roman baths and amphitheaters sat alongside wooden homes of Germanic auxiliaries. In Sirmium, a key Danubian town, imperial palaces, military barracks, and foreign merchant houses formed a single, dusty network. These towns weren't Roman in the classical sense. They were frontier zones where law, culture, and identity overlapped. The architecture mixed Roman and local styles. The languages spoken ranged from Latin and Greek to Gothic, Syriac, and Aramaic. Coins from these regions often bore dual symbology, a Roman eagle beside a local deity. Over time, these places developed distinct identities, loyal to the empire not out of blood or tradition, but because of mutual dependence. Religious fluidity and ritual at the edge. Religious life along the frontier was eclectic and deeply localized. Soldiers worshipped Mithras in underground caves, where initiates underwent silent rites beneath carved reliefs. Shrines to Jupiter Dolichenes, a syncretic Roman-Syrian god, dotted the east. Local deities were often incorporated into Roman ritual, offering both political stability and cultural tolerance. Christianity, though persecuted at times, spread through soldier networks and frontier cities. A soldier might sacrifice to Mars before battle, celebrate the Saturnalia in December, and attend a Christian service in secret the next week. The imperial system allowed for religious layering, as long as it didn't challenge the authority of the state. Logistics and the backbone of the frontier. More than anything, the frontiers were logistical achievements. Each major fort or camp had granaries horia, with thick walls to protect food from heat and theft. Workshops fabrici, for armor and weapons repair. Warehouses storing cloaks, sandals, spare tent canvas, and horse feed. Bathhouses, often elaborate, used for both hygiene and social cohesion. Records offices, where duty rosters, payrolls, and supply manifests were maintained. Everything was counted, logged, and resupplied on a schedule. A missing shipment of barley could unravel an entire unit's cohesion. To the soldier on watch, it may have seemed mundane, but without these systems, the borders would fail long before an enemy arrived. Women, families, and the quiet domestic frontier. Though official Roman policy forbade soldiers from marrying while in service, this was routinely ignored in practice, particularly on the frontier. Many forts had unofficial wives or partners living just outside the gates. Children born to soldiers were raised in the rhythm of military life, often joining the same unit upon maturity. Some evidence, especially from burial inscriptions, shows that women worked within forts as laundresses, cooks, midwives, and even scribes. Roman forts were not all male domains. They were militarized communities. Archaeological finds show children's shoes beside adult sandals, toys made from bone or carved wood, grave markers memorializing a wife of the standard bearer or daughter of the centurion. The frontier was not just defended by arms. It was inhabited, shaped, and softened by domestic life. The edge as opportunity and instability. For many, the frontier was a land of opportunity. Freedmen could find work provisioning garrisons. Traders sold everything from wine to olive oil, dice to perfumes. Craftsmen set up shops for sandals, tools, and armor parts. Foreigners, even from outside, the empire found employment or citizenship through service. But opportunity walked hand in hand with instability. One generation might thrive on a military contract. The next might be overrun during an invasion. Fortunes turned quickly. Entire towns disappeared when border policy shifted. Others exploded in size with a new garrison's arrival. Life on the frontier was precarious, but full of possibility. When the line becomes a door. By the 4th century, the frontier had changed. No longer simply a wall to defend, it had become a zone of negotiation. Rome began to settle allied tribes, foederati, within its borders, offering them land and status in exchange for military service. These included Goths settled along the Danube, Franks granted lands in Gaul, Saracens guarding desert routes in the east. This was pragmatic. It filled manpower gaps, It secured loyalty through integration. But it also eroded the concept of the frontier. What had been a line between Roman and other now became a zone of blurred identity. Loyalty was no longer geographic, it was relational. So we leave this section with a question not easily answered by maps or records. What does it mean to defend an empire when the edge is not a wall, but a way of life? The frontier never truly fell in one day. It cracked, it bent, it rearranged itself slowly, sometimes violently, sometimes with barely a ripple. The soldiers stationed on the Danube or the Euphrates didn't wake up to a vanished empire. Instead, they watched as uniforms changed, commanders shifted, and the meaning of Rome itself slipped into something new. In this final section, we examine the decline of the Roman frontier system, the lived experience of collapse, and the quiet resilience of those who remained when the banners were lowered or replaced. The 4th and 5th century strain. By the late 4th century, Rome's frontiers faced threats from within and without. Along the Danube, the arrival of the Huns drove Gothic tribes toward Roman borders. Rome, attempting diplomacy, allowed some Gothic groups to settle a plan that quickly unraveled due to poor provisioning, corruption, and mutual mistrust. In 376 CE, this escalated into full-scale rebellion, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople in 378. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens was killed, and 2/3 of his army annihilated. This defeat shocked the empire. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had died in open battle against foreign forces. On the Euphrates, the situation remained volatile. Persian kings continued to test the borders, sometimes engaging in direct sieges of key cities. One of the most dramatic episodes was the siege of Amida, 359 CE, in which the city, a fortified frontier outpost, resisted the Sassanid army for 73 days before falling. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman officer and historian, described the siege in harrowing detail of boiling pitch, crumbling walls, and men hurling stones until their arms gave out. These were not merely military defeats, they revealed systemic exhaustion. The gradual withdrawal. Rome did not abandon the frontiers in a single act. Instead, the empire retrenched, prioritizing core regions and leaving less defensible areas to fend for themselves or transition into new orders. In the West, some forts were emptied quietly, their garrisons reassigned or disbanded. Others became independent enclaves, still Roman in style, but no longer receiving orders or pay from distant capitals. As imperial cohesion waned, local warlords and bishops took on more civic roles, organizing defense, distributing food, and negotiating with outsiders. In the East, the frontier became increasingly urban and bureaucratic. Cities like Nisibis, once critical military hubs, were ceded in treaties or turned into border towns of shifting allegiance. The Byzantine model, inheriting the Eastern Roman legacy, would eventually rely more on diplomacy, tribute, and religious alliances to manage its eastern edge. Rome did not fall, it transformed, and the frontiers became gateways to new powers. What the archaeology tells us. Modern excavations along these frontiers reveal gradual adaptation, not sudden ruin. Fort walls were repaired with local stone long after Roman engineers had departed. Roman-style pottery continued to be made, albeit cruder in quality. Coins from later centuries often depict barbarian kings imitating Roman emperors, wearing togas and diadems, sending a message: "We are the new Rome." In some frontier towns, churches replaced temples, bishops replaced prefects. Latin gave way to local dialects, but inscriptions still began with imperator or dominus for generations. This speaks to a deeper truth: people adapted. They didn't stop being Roman overnight. They stopped being Roman when it no longer made sense to be. Life after Rome. What happened to the family who lived in the shadow of frontier forts? Some migrated inward, seeking security in the empire's shrinking core. Others stayed, blending into new polities, Gothic kingdoms in the west, Persian-administered towns in the east. Still others persisted in place, slowly absorbing new customs while retaining Roman patterns of life. A former centurion's son might become a village leader under a Gothic king. A baker's daughter might marry a Sassanid soldier and live across the old Euphrates line. A once active Roman fort might become a grain depot for local farmers. Its towers used to dry figs or hang laundry. The frontier, once bristling with spears, softened into landscape. The frontier in memory and myth. Long after the last Roman patrol crossed the Danube or stood atop a Euphrates bastion, the idea of the Roman frontier endured. Medieval chroniclers in the East still referred to the region near the Euphrates as Limes Romanus. In the West, Carolingian rulers styled themselves as defenders of Christendom, evoking Roman frontier imagery. Islamic scholars, too, writing in the Abbasid period, studied Roman fortresses and admired their resilience and urban planning. The physical frontier faded, the mental frontier remained. Even in modern times, traces linger. Village names in the Balkans trace back to Roman garrisons. Syriac Christian churches near the old Mesopotamian frontier still contain Roman-era stones. Lines on modern maps echo old military roads and outposts, visible even from satellite images. A quiet kind of legacy. The frontier didn't leave behind emperors or grand monuments. It left behind patterns of pragmatic negotiation with difference, of infrastructure meant not to dominate, but to endure quietly, of people who held the line not for glory, but because it was their home. Unlike Rome's marble capitals or triumphal arches, the frontier's legacy is humble, found in plowed fields, reused bricks, or faint grooves where Roman carts once passed. So as we close this story, we reflect on the quiet power of borders, not as lines that separate us, but as places where people survive, change, and begin again. Is the legacy of empire found in its centers of power or at its forgotten edges, where life continues after the empire is gone? Story 5. The hidden bureaucrats, scribes, clerks, and the machine of empire. You've heard the names. Diocletian, Galerius, Constantine. They issue edicts, they command armies, they redraw the map. But behind the emperors, a quiet force labored without fanfare: the bureaucracy. The Roman Empire did not run on charisma alone. It ran on papyrus scrolls, ink-stained fingers, and tedious record-keeping. It ran on clerks who never held a sword, who might never leave their province, and who were rarely mentioned in the pages of history unless something went wrong. This story is about them. The birth of the imperial bureaucracy. Before Diocletian, the imperial bureaucracy was already growing, but inconsistently, chaotically, and unevenly. In the Republic, officials were elected and held office for short terms. Under the early empire, the emperor gradually absorbed authority, but relied heavily on freedmen and household staff. By the 3rd century, especially during the crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE, emperors came and went so quickly that there was little time to establish consistent policy, much less an organized bureaucracy. Enter Diocletian. To stabilize the state, he knew he needed more than armies and coinage. He needed information, control, and above all, structure. And structure requires scribes, the notari and the secretaries. At the top of this administrative pyramid sat the notari, senior clerks who recorded the emperor's decisions and transmitted his will across the empire. These were not mere transcribers. The primicerius notarium, chief of the notaries, often had access to the emperor in private, drafting letters that could start wars or appoint governors. Notari sometimes accompanied generals in the field, maintaining dispatches and confirming supply routes. They were responsible for recording edicts, monitoring petitions, and managing archives. A scribe could, with a flick of a quill, condemn a governor to disgrace or elevate a city to regional prominence. Chanceries and the bureaucratic hierarchy. Each major administrative region, especially after the Tetrarchy's division of the empire into dioceses and prefectures, required a bureaucratic apparatus. This included Scrinia chancery departments, each dedicated to different functions: petitions, legal decisions, foreign affairs, and military commands. Commentarians, scribes who maintained official journals, recording legal rulings, senatorial decrees, or military appointments. Ob actis, keepers of public records, essential for reviewing land disputes or tax conflicts. These officials worked in silence but held immense power, precisely because their work made the empire legible. Without them, the imperial machine would grind to a halt. Paperwork and power. Imagine the life of a mid-level scribe in a provincial office, perhaps in Antioch, Sirmium, or Alexandria. His day might begin before sunrise, reviewing petitions from locals seeking tax relief, drafting instructions to frontier commanders about grain distribution, recording decisions made by a traveling imperial official, archiving previous records into bundles sealed with lead bully, then stored in dry, secure rooms. There were no typewriters, no carbon copies, no email servers. Every record was copied by hand, often in duplicate, sometimes even triplicate if the matter was significant. Mistakes were costly. A scribe could be fined or demoted for inaccuracies. But for those who excelled, the rewards were real promotion, land, even nobility. The role of language and literacy. Latin remained the official language of administration in the West. In the East, Greek was widely used, especially in legal and commercial contexts. A skilled scribe was often multilingual, and many offices employed translators to navigate between imperial Latin and local dialects. This linguistic bridge made scribes critical to diplomacy, writing letters to foreign rulers; legal consistency, ensuring laws were understood across cultures; tax assessments, translating land records and agricultural outputs. To be literate, and especially numerate, was to possess a kind of quiet power in a world where most could not read. The cost of administration. By the 4th century, Diocletian and his successors had created a bureaucracy as vast as the empire itself. But this came at a price. The number of officials ballooned. Administrative offices became hereditary in some cases, with sons inheriting scribal roles from their fathers. Corruption crept in, as access to records could mean control over property, inheritance, or tax status. Some contemporaries complained that there are more people collecting taxes than there are paying them. Still, without these officials, the empire would have collapsed under its own weight. Secrecy, surveillance, and the rise of control. Not all scribes simply wrote, some watched. Under emperors like Constantine and later Theodosius, scribes began to take on surveillance roles, monitoring governors for signs of disloyalty, reporting on military officers suspected of ambition, maintaining files on prominent families or suspected Christian sects, especially before Constantine's conversion. These were the quiet beginnings of an imperial intelligence network, cloaked in paperwork rather than armor. The pen was not just mightier than the sword, it became the eye of the state. The scribe in the shadow. It is easy to forget the scribe. He signs the decree but does not issue it. He transcribes the victory report but does not ride into battle. He files the edict on church exemptions but does not build the church. Yet without him, nothing happens. His wax tablet becomes the bridge between emperor and general, between law and landowner, between Rome and its most distant village. He is always in the room, but never the focus. So we close this first section not with a battle or a coronation, but with a quiet moment. A scribe hunched over a wooden desk, a candle flickering beside a worn stylus, a sealed scroll placed into a clay jar. No one cheers, no one notices, but somewhere an order is followed, a record is kept, and the empire endures one more day. In a world built on power, who holds the quill that defines it? In the age of Diocletian and his successors, the Roman Empire came to resemble something strange to the modern eye. A government more obsessed with order than expansion, more focused on measuring land and counting grain than winning glorious conquests. Behind the legions, the law courts, and the churches stood a quiet machine of paperwork, taxation, and hierarchy. This was the paper empire, and its quiet architects were the clerks and scribes of the imperial administration. This section examines the economic logic, bureaucratic mechanisms, and social impact of the imperial paper trail. For the average citizen, the empire was not a distant emperor or a marble forum, it was a tax form, a census, and a notary's seal. Diocletian's great tax reform. One of the most transformative acts of Diocletian's reign, and one of the most boring by dramatic standards, was the reorganization of the empire's tax system. Prior to Diocletian, taxation was haphazard, based on inconsistent assessments, often farmed out to private collectors, vulnerable to corruption, underreporting, and bribery. Diocletian responded with the capitatio iugatio system, a strange hybrid of head tax and land tax. The capitatio counted people, their labor, professions, even animals. The iugatio measured land, not just how much, but its quality and yield. The result was a system that standardized taxation across the empire based on calculable units of production, and it required an immense bureaucracy to maintain. The census and the scroll. To make the tax system work, Diocletian ordered regular censuses not just every few decades, but every 5 years in many regions. These surveys included lists of every household member, measurements of land plots, livestock counts, declarations of profession or trade, reports on changes, birth, deaths, marriages, sales. All this was recorded on papyrus or parchment, cataloged in regional administrative centers, and reported upward through layers of bureaucracy. For the average Roman subject, this meant being visited by a census official, often escorted by a guard, swearing oaths to the accuracy of your report, receiving a record tablet, sometimes stamped with a wax seal to prove your compliance. Failure to appear or falsification could result in fines, confiscation, or even forced labor. The office of the rationales, rations. Behind every census was a labyrinth of offices called the rations, the empire's financial nerve centers. Each diocese, a new administrative unit created by Diocletian, had a rationales, the chief financial officer, staff who processed census data, calculated tax obligations, and prepared reports, correspondents who coordinated with military provisioning offices and grain depots. These were not glamorous jobs, but they were essential. A miscalculation in Antioch could cause food shortages in Palmyra. A forged land deed in Gaul might spark a legal dispute that lasted decades. A missing census roll in Egypt could lead to overtaxation or rebellion. And so the clerks and scribes labored quietly, chasing accuracy in an empire of uneven terrain, shifting borders, and imperfect cooperation. The burden of precision. Precision, though noble in concept, became a burden in execution. Small landowners were taxed at the same rate as large estates despite differing capacity. Regions hit by drought or locusts often found no relief, as the tax rolls were not easily amended. Entire villages might be declared in arrears for years due to outdated or missing records. And because tax liability was often tied to individuals and families, the system led to a form of bureaucratic inheritance. Sons inherited their fathers' tax obligations. Professions became hereditary, especially in trades linked to taxation, such as millers or tanners. Villages collectively negotiated tax burdens, encouraging compliance, but also communal pressure and punishment. The result was social immobility, fostered not by law alone, but by ledger lines and account columns. Taxation and the military machine. Why all this effort? Because the empire's army, perhaps 400,000 men strong at its height, had to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid. Fortresses needed grain. Horses needed fodder. Roads and bridges had to be maintained. Blacksmiths, leather workers, and armorers required raw materials and wages. The scribes were not feeding a bureaucracy. They were feeding an army that held the borders of the known world. But in times of peace, this burden felt oppressive. In times of invasion or civil war, it felt justified. Many complaints about imperial taxes came not from injustice, but from efficiency. The machine worked too well and it didn't care who it crushed. The codices and legal bureaucracy. Taxation, of course, spawned disputes. A merchant might claim exemption. A farmer might protest overmeasurement of his land. A widow might demand her deceased husband's arrears be canceled. These required documentation, and thus birthed legal codification. Under Diocletian and especially Constantine, imperial edicts were collected into codices, early law books, such as Codex Gregorianus, Codex Hermogeneus, later the Codex Theodosianus. Scribes became legal specialists drafting verdicts, copying precedents, and maintaining court records. These texts were copied across the empire and became living documents, with marginal notes, commentary, and regional annotations. Law was no longer only oral or senatorial, it was now archived and reproducible. Corruption, fraud, and the gray economy. Of course, where records exist, forgeries follow. Some scribes accepted bribes to lose files or amend land categories. Tax collectors skimmed from the total. Elite landowners sometimes pressured clerks to falsify assessments, especially in remote provinces. Counterfeit seals were used to forge exemption orders. These abuses were well known. Edicts frequently warned against those who defraud the treasury by deception of parchment. Still, the bureaucracy often functioned despite or perhaps because of these negotiated corruptions. They formed part of the everyday logic of empire, as familiar to citizens as rainfall or rumor. The human face of paperwork. To imagine the imperial bureaucracy as faceless is to misunderstand it. Clerks lived in real homes, struggled with bad lighting, dealt with family illnesses, argued with coworkers, and worked in offices that were often drafty, dim, and filled with the smell of drying ink. They suffered when the empire suffered. They were reassigned in times of war. Their scrolls were burned when cities fell. Some were even targeted during revolts seen as the face of oppression. Yet many also rose. From scribe to provincial secretary. From secretary to magister officerum, the head of the imperial administration. Some even entered senatorial rank, if they played their cards well. The bureaucratic ladder was real if steep, and it required not only literacy, but loyalty. So we end this section not with a grand climax, but with a strange reflection. The empire's most powerful tool was not a legion or a wall, but a man in a small room, writing a name on a piece of parchment, folding it once, sealing it with wax, and filing it into a wooden drawer. What happens when the empire knows your name, but not your face, and still demands your grain? By the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire looked vastly different than it had 100 years earlier. Emperors ruled more like administrators than conquerors. Armies fought civil wars as often as foreign threats. Taxes were counted in bundles of parchment, and clerks, once humble copyists, had become the bones of the state. As invasions grew, provinces fractured, and emperors perished, the bureaucracy did something extraordinary. It survived. This final section explores how the Roman bureaucracy outlasted Rome itself, transitioning into the Middle Ages and shaping the very concept of statecraft in Europe and beyond. The empire does fall all at once. In popular imagination, the Roman Empire falls in 476 CE when Romulus Augustulus, the last Western emperor, is deposed. But for the bureaucrats, for the clerks in Trier, Carthage, or Aquileia, the office doors didn't slam shut that year. In fact, many continued doing exactly what they'd done the day before: recording grain inventories, drafting legal judgments, corresponding with regional bishops, calculating taxes, even if fewer arrived. The fall of the Western Empire was a political event, but the machinery of governance powered by parchment and habit kept churning. The rise of the bishops and the transfer of authority. As imperial control waned, bishops and local elites assumed many administrative roles. In Gaul, bishops began issuing civic decrees and maintaining property records. In North Africa, church treasurers took over tax collection often more efficiently. In Italy, monasteries preserved tax rolls and land registries, continuing the scribal tradition under Christian auspices. This wasn't a revolution, it was a mutation. The scribe who once served the comes rei privati, count of the private estate, might now work for the diocese, using the same skills: copying, filing, verifying, sealing. Rome's bureaucracy didn't collapse. It changed costumes. The Eastern Roman continuity. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire did not fall at all. It evolved into the Byzantine Empire, and with it, the bureaucracy deepened and formalized. Emperor Justinian, 527–565, undertook a massive codification project, the Corpus Juris Civilis, employing hundreds of scribes. Tax records became more standardized. The state minted diplomas for clerks, granting legal authority to issue, sign, and seal documents. These clerks became part of an elite caste, often educated in state-sponsored schools. Scribes no longer sat in the shadows. In Constantinople, they walked marble halls, wore state robes, and sometimes influenced imperial policy directly. The survival of the Roman filing cabinet. One of the most remarkable facts of late antiquity is the archival instinct. Rome stored everything: land records going back decades, legal precedents cited for generations, military rosters, census scrolls, church exemptions, even death inventories. In Egypt, for example, thousands of papyri survive not from emperors, but from clerks and scribes. A letter from a tax assessor demanding missing sheep. A copy of a grain receipt with smudged ink. A notice about land inheritance, still rolled and sealed. These are not dramatic, they are not thrilling, but they are survival tools for both the people who wrote them and the empires they served. The training of a bureaucrat. Even as Rome fractured, bureaucratic training continued. In Constantinople, the Chartophylakian Imperial Archive served as both repository and training center. Young scribes were taught calligraphy, filing systems, seal authentication, legal Latin and Greek, protocols for imperial communication. Graduates received official appointments, often with considerable prestige. In time, these roles became hereditary, forming an upper-middle class of administrators. Some eventually entered the Senate. Others ran dioceses. Many remained nameless, known only by their handwriting. The dark side of the bureaucratic legacy. But the legacy wasn't only efficiency, it was also rigidity. Bureaucrats were known for following rules even when harmful. Exploitation. Systems of taxation became ever more extractive, especially in rural areas. Opacity. The complexity of forms and procedures alienated the average citizen. In late Roman Egypt, some petitions were written entirely in scribal code, intelligible only to trained insiders. Power came not from law, but from knowing how to navigate the forms. Even bishops complained. One 5th-century sermon declared, "The ink of the clerk has drowned the voice of justice." From Roman scribes to medieval chancelleries. When new kingdoms rose Gothic, Frankish, Lombard, they didn't discard the Roman bureaucracy. They adopted it. Roman titles like notarius, comes, and prepositus survived in Merovingian France. Early medieval kings issued charters in Latin, drafted by former Roman clerks. Land surveys, known as polyptychs, mimicked Roman estate records. Even the Carolingian capitularies' royal decrees followed Roman scribal formatting. In short, the form outlived the empire. The Roman scribe, though forgotten by name, taught Europe how to govern. The pen that outlasted the sword. We often remember Rome for its colosseums, legions, laws, emperors. But in truth, its longest-lasting legacy may be a desk, a wax tablet, and a man with a stylus. The sword defended the empire, but the scribe recorded what mattered. And it is his record, not the battle, that we still hold in libraries, museums, and archives today. So the next time you sign a form, file your taxes, or submit an official request, you are touching the distant echo of a Roman bureaucrat, hunched in a lamplit office, muttering about grain allotments, smoothing the edge of a scroll, and sealing it shut with lead. Did the Roman Empire truly end, or did it simply become paperwork? Story 6. The Forgotten Frontier Life on the Danube Limes. You are standing near a river. The water runs wide, cold, and fast. To your south lies Rome, not the city, but the civilization. To your north, the unknown. This is the Danube, Limes, the fortified frontier that marked one of the empire's longest and most volatile borders. Stretching over 1,700 miles from the Black Forest to the Black Sea, the Danube River wasn't just a line on a map. It was a lifeline, a barrier, a highway, and a border zone full of soldiers, farmers, merchants, fugitives, and spies. This is not a story of emperors or epic battles. This is a story of daily survival, of the people who lived in liminality between safety and danger, between empire and everything else. The geography of the Danube. To understand the frontier, you must understand the land. The Danube was wide and winding, with floodplains, cliffs, forests, and wetlands. Its course formed a natural moat, a defensive line that was easier to patrol than the open plains of Gaul or the deserts of Syria. But the Danube was not impenetrable. In winter, it froze solid, becoming a bridge for invaders. In spring, it flooded, washing away outposts and roads. And in every season, it invited contact, trade, migration, war. To secure it, Rome built a chain of forts, watchtowers, and supply depots along its length. This was the Danube Limes, a living system of defense, logistics, and settlement. Life in a frontier fort. Let us enter one of these forts, Carnuntum, located in modern Austria. At its peak, Carnuntum housed a full legion, nearly 5,000 men, as well as a civilian settlement outside its walls. Inside, the fort was a world of routines. Morning drills, even in snow. Armor inspections, endlessly repeated. Patrol rotations, with scouts monitoring river traffic. Mess halls, latrines, and barracks lined with damp straw. Officers kept record supply manifests, troop rosters, construction logs feeding the empire's insatiable bureaucracy. Outside the walls lived traders, many of them Greek or Syrian. Local women, often married to soldiers unofficially. Freed slaves who ran taverns, bathhouses, and bakeries. Retired veterans farming land plots granted by the state. This was not a Roman city, nor a barbarian village. It was something in between, a zone of blending. Encounters with the other. Beyond the Danube lived a mosaic of peoples. Sarmatians, Quadi, Goths, Marcomanni, and dozens of other groups lumped together as barbarians in Roman texts. But life on the frontier blurred those distinctions. Traders crossed the river with amber, furs, and slaves. Mercenaries were hired from northern tribes to defend Roman forts. Diplomats negotiated treaties, hostage exchanges, and marriage alliances. Many barbarians spoke passable Latin. Some wore Roman tunics and carried Roman coins in leather pouches. And many Roman settlers along the Danube had foreign wives, foreign names, and foreign gods. The line between Roman and non-Roman was not a wall. It was a weaving thread, constantly shifting. Fear and fortification. Still, the frontier was not peaceful. Raids were common. Small bands crossing the river at night to steal livestock. Larger incursions during imperial succession crises. Retaliatory Roman strikes that burned villages and took prisoners. And with each attack came fortification. Ditches dug deeper. Walls built higher. Watch schedules made harsher. Civilians moved into fortified settlements called burgi. Life on the Danube limes meant constant alertness, but also constant compromise. People lived with one eye on the river, always wondering, will the ice hold? Will the scouts return? Will the next emperor care about us? Weather, trade, and survival. The climate could be brutal. Snow in the winter, floods in the spring, mosquitoes in the summer, fog in the fall. But the Danube also brought trade. Ships moved timber, salt, wine, wool, oil, and weapons up and down the river. Boatmen and porters became key figures, even cultural brokers. Forts had markets, often held weekly, where locals and soldiers mingled. Coins from as far as Alexandria and Antioch have been found in frontier towns. So have Indian spices, Persian textiles, and Germanic jewelry. Even in times of fear, the Danube remained a bridge as much as a barrier. The invisible people of the limes. We know the names of a few generals stationed along the frontier. We have reports from governors and letters from emperors. But we do not know the names of the bakers who fed the legions, the midwives who delivered bobbies outside the fort gates, the boatmen who ferried timber across flooded tributaries, the scribes who documented land grants to retired centurions. They left no grand tombs. They wrote no histories. But they built the frontier in small, unheralded ways by simply enduring. So as we end this first section, imagine a quiet dusk at Carnuntum. A soldier scraping mud from his sandals. A child chasing a stray goat along the wall. A merchant counting coins under torchlight. A mother boiling barley for the evening meal. All of them listening for the splash of oars, the howl of wind, or the distant crack of ice on the Danube. When does a border become a home, and when does it become a warning? By the 3rd century CE, the Danube frontier had become one of the Roman Empire's most critical pressure points. The line between defense and integration grew increasingly blurred. Soldiers became settlers. Barbarians became allies. and the notion of what it meant to be Roman began to fray not from attack, but from accommodation. In this section, we look deeper into the human mechanics of this liminal zone, the mixed loyalties, the odd partnerships, and the quiet stories of endurance that shaped Rome's edge for centuries. Because out here on the frontier, everyone served something but not always the same thing. The soldier farmers of the limes. By Diocletian's reign, the empire was stretched thin. It could no longer afford to maintain a full standing army on every frontier. So it adapted. Soldiers along the Danube were increasingly granted land to farm, creating a hybrid role, soldier farmer. These men maintained watch at forts in rotation, grew their own food on nearby plots, raised families, often unofficially in civilian settlements, became part of the local economy. This arrangement cut costs and increased local investment, but it also tethered the military to place. A soldier who farmed land had a stake in the soil, but also something to lose. And over generations, this blurred the line between military garrison and farming village. Some forts were still active outposts. Others became quiet ruins, ringed by orchards and pastures. Mixed marriages, mixed identities. Although official Roman law discouraged soldiers from marrying until retirement, this was widely ignored on the frontier. Many soldiers took local wives, often from non-Roman tribal groups. Children were raised with Roman customs, but spoke local dialects at home. Household gods sat beside Roman Lares on the hearth. Birth names might be Latin, but nicknames were often Gothic or Sarmatian. By the mid-4th century, the Danube frontier was populated by people who were neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, and who cared less about identity than about survival. A young man born in a Danube village might learn to read Latin in the fort school, hunt with his Sarmatian uncle, work as a clerk for a Roman official, marry the daughter of a Gothic merchant, and one day fight in a Roman uniform against a tribe his grandfather once belonged to. This wasn't betrayal, it was life on the line. Fort bureaucracy and the logic of loyalty. Even the smallest frontier fort generated paperwork, grain allotments, rotation schedules, supply manifests, soldier evaluations, land use records. A literate class of clerks, often recruited from local families, served as the engine of this paperwork. Some rose through the ranks. Others operated in a kind of gray zone familiar with both Roman legalism and local custom, acting as translators and mediators. Loyalty was not abstract, it was transactional. The empire provided land, protection, and coin. The locals provided men, food, and silence. Both sides kept the system going, even as trust frayed. Rome might call them loyal subjects, but most saw themselves as river folk, bound to place first and Rome second. The foederati, friends and foes. One of the most defining features of the late frontier was the rise of the foederati tribal groups settled along the Danube under treaty, sworn to defend Rome in exchange for land, autonomy, or gold. The logic was simple. Rome could not police every mile. Local tribes wanted legitimacy, access to trade, and protection from rivals. A treaty suited both. But these alliances were fragile. Leaders changed. Gold ran out. Promises were broken. One year, a group of foederati might repel an invading tribe. The next, they might turn on the Romans over a missed payment or an insulted envoy. The frontier became a chessboard of conditional loyalty, with treaties inked in Latin and broken in silence. The role of religion and local belief. As Christianity spread, frontier life became more complicated. Roman soldiers began converting, some sincerely, others to curry favor. Local cults persisted: moon gods, forest spirits, river deities. Churches were built next to shrines. Pagan and Christian festivals overlapped, sometimes uneasily. A priest might bless a harvest one day and cast out spirits the next. A Roman official might enforce Christian doctrine, but still light incense to household gods at home. Religion, like identity, was fluid on the frontier. Faith was practiced as pragmatism, whatever kept the livestock alive, the river calm, and the taxes paid. Women of the frontier. Women played an invisible but central role in frontier life, especially as the army settled and soldiers began raising families. They ran inns and taverns, small farms and vegetable plots, bathhouses and local shops, informal schools for children. They also acted as midwives, herbalists, and healers, cultural translators between Roman and local customs, record keepers, especially when husbands died or were away on patrol. In times of violence, women often led efforts to bury the dead, negotiate with invaders, or evacuate children. Some were captured in raids, others escaped across the river. Many were simply never recorded, lost to history except in stray inscriptions, grave goods, or oral tradition. But without them, the frontier would have collapsed long before the empire did. The sound of uncertainty. Living on the Danube frontier meant listening to the rustle of trees beyond the wall, to the tone of a trader's voice, to the creak of ice thickening at night, to the cadence of Latin mixed with Gothic in the marketplace. Survival depended on sensing when things shifted, and they often did. Borders were not lines. They were zones where loyalty, identity, language, and law bent with the wind. And the people of the limes became masters of ambiguity, not because they chose to, but because it was the only way to live. So we end this section not with a raid or a rebellion, but with an ordinary question that many on the Danube asked themselves. How do you build a life when the map might change tomorrow, and the only thing more dangerous than your enemies is your emperor forgetting you exist? In the cold winter of 376 CE, a wave of desperate Gothic refugees appeared on the banks of the Danube, seeking asylum inside the Roman Empire. They were fleeing the Huns, whose sudden appearance in the steppes had shattered the fragile tribal alliances beyond Rome's northern borders. The local Roman commanders, seeing an opportunity to both appear generous and acquire labor or soldiers, allowed them to cross. But things did not go as planned. Within a few years, the Danube frontier, once held together by stone, treaty, and habit, was in flames. This is the story of how Rome's great river frontier fractured, not in a single cataclysm, but in a slow, human unraveling. The crossing that changed everything. The initial crossing in 376 was, in theory, a legal process. The Goths were to be disarmed, counted, and resettled. But the Roman bureaucracy along the Danube, overworked and underpaid, broke down almost immediately. Officials took bribes to let in more refugees than authorized. Local commanders sold food at extortionate prices. Promised land allotments were never delivered. The winter brought starvation. Anger festered. Gothic leaders, once cooperative, now led revolts. By 378, the situation exploded at the Battle of Adrianople, where a Gothic army defeated and killed Emperor Valens. It was the beginning of the end. But not for the empire, not yet. It was the beginning of the end for the frontier way of life. When the forts fell silent, after Adrianople, many of the frontier forts were abandoned or burned. Some were destroyed in open conflict. Others were simply left behind, their troops recalled, their supplies cut. A few were resettled by local populations or even former enemies. Archaeological digs show evidence of sudden abandonment. Unburied coins scattered across floors. Cookware left on hearths. watchtowers that collapsed from neglect. But in some places, life continued just without Rome. In Hungary and modern Serbia, former forts became local power centers, ruled by Gothic or mixed Roman-Germanic elites who maintained aspects of Roman administration and trade. In effect, the frontier was no longer a line. It was a patchwork where loyalty, law, and culture varied from village to village. The localization of identity. As central control weakened, local identities strengthened. People no longer saw themselves as Romans or barbarians, but as Danube people. Trade adapted smaller scale, more local but still active. Religion evolved Christianity, blended with tribal beliefs. Language shifted. Latin coexisted with Germanic tongues and Slavic dialects. This wasn't a collapse, it was an adaptation. Some elements of Roman order persisted: writing, architecture, even taxes in certain regions. But they were locally managed, no longer tethered to a distant emperor. A 5th century village elder might refer to himself as a Roman. But his grandson would use a different term. And his great-grandson might not know Latin at all. Memory, ruins, and the echo of Rome. What happens when a civilization fades, but its buildings remain? Former forts became monasteries. Watchtowers were repurposed as granaries or homes. Stones from Roman walls were used to build new churches or barns. Inscriptions were copied without being understood. To later medieval travelers, the Danube's ancient forts seemed like the work of giants or saints, not engineers. But some memory lingered. In names passed down, Aquincum became Abuta. Carnuntum's ruins still stood on the Austrian plains. In routes that followed the old Roman roads. In laws and customs that echoed Roman forms. The Danube frontier had vanished, but its ghost haunted the landscape. Survivors and their stories. What became of the people? Some fled south, deeper into imperial lands. Others stayed and adapted, becoming citizens of new kingdoms. Many intermarried, assimilated, or vanished into history. We know a few by name. A Roman soldier turned Gothic chieftain. A bishop who refused to leave his ruined see. A local trader who switched loyalties and dialects 3 times in one generation. But most are anonymous. Their stories survive only in broken tiles, rusted belt buckles, reused bricks, and the shapes of foundations barely visible beneath modern fields. They lived between ages too Roman for the tribes, too tribal for the Romans, and made lives anyway. The frontier's afterlife. Centuries later, new empires would rise along the Danube. The Byzantines reclaimed parts of the river in the 6th century. The Franks, Avars, Bulgars, and eventually, the Ottomans all saw the Danube not just as a border but as a strategic artery. Medieval castles and border towns were often built on Roman ruins. Even today, you can follow the old limes. Walk the stone paths through what was once Sirmium or Viminacium. Stand in the reconstructed fort at Kelheim, imagining the watchmen staring into fog. See the outlines of barracks, the remnants of gates, the faint Latin etched in broken stone. The frontier is gone, but its shape remains. Reflections from the river. The Danube continues to flow. It does not remember the watchmen. It does not recall the treaties. It does not speak Latin or Gothic. But it still marks a place between worlds. And maybe that is the true legacy of the Danube frontier, not as a line of defense, but as a space of connection. A place where survival meant compromise, where identity was fluid, where ordinary people lived between empires, and in doing so, shaped the world that followed. When a border ceases to be guarded, does it disappear, or does it become something more enduring than walls or flags?